Listen to how this straightforward chord progression can turn into something that sounds like this. In case you didn't recognize, that's the keys part from This Will Be an Everlasting Love by Natalie Cole. And a lot of the excitement in that keys part comes from passing chords. That is a chord we insert between two existing chords in a chord progression. As piano players, we love passing chords because they're a chance to use our creativity. They're really infinite passing chords that you could come up with, so long as you follow the basic principle of tension and resolution. In the passing chord, there's a moment of added tension or creating something unexpected for the listener that then gets resolved when we return to the main chord progression. So let's look at the keys part I just played as a way to explore 5 useful concepts that will help you to create your own passing chords. Now I'm going to refer to chords as numbers. So this chord progression becomes 1, 6, 2, 5. And if that's an unfamiliar concept to you, I have other videos on the concept of numbers. One other prerequisite skill, I will assume that you understand chord symbol notation. So if any of the chord symbols I use in this video are unfamiliar to you, you can grab my 2-page guide to chord symbol notation at the piano. So let's start with this part. We have this pattern happening over the 5 chord several times in this chord progression. This is a good introduction to the concept of alternating chords. Any passing chord is taking us from some sort of departure chord to some sort of arrival chord. And sometimes those are the same chord. So sometimes, for example, we could just be hanging out on the 1 chord and looking for some way to create a little bit of interest and variety, adding in this other passing chord that comes back immediately to the 1 chord. And that's what's happening here. If we look at just what happens in my right hand, I'm alternating between inversions of the 1 major triad, in this case that's B flat major, and the 2 minor triad. This is one of my favorite ways to create variety over the 1 chord. And we can look at variations on this in a moment. But first, look at how useful this is. We have 2 shapes that share none of the same notes. So if we invert them, here I'm going to now play the first inversion of the 1 chord, and then the inversion of the 2 chord, next inversion of the 1 chord, the next inversion of the 2 chord, and I end back up on root position. What happens when you use those inversions and you move through these 2 chords in this alternating fashion is that every single note in the chord has a moving melody. It's like we've created this little 6-note scale through the combination of these 2 chords. And so every voice, every note in the chord is like a singer moving up 1 note at a time through that 6-note scale. So this is a very useful pattern to learn for your right hand in order to create chordal fills in this style of music. And you can do it with 1 in the bass. You can also do it with 5 in the bass, or other bass notes for that matter. But if you listen to it with 5 in the bass, that's what's happening in this Natalie Cole keys part. We're essentially creating the sound of a 5 sus chord, but the easiest way to recognize the shapes is simply 5 in the bass and then alternating between a 1 major triad and 2 minor triad in the right hand. And we can look at some common variations on this idea. You can also alternate between the 1 and the 4 chord. So this would be B flat and E flat, and I'm playing an inversion of the E flat in my right hand. This is very common. It's just a little bit less tidy than the 1 and the 2 chord because there is 1 shared note between the 2 chords, the root. So as you move up through the inversions, sometimes you'll have a voice that has to stay twice in a row on that root note. We can also alternate between the 1 and the 4 minor. So this would be E flat minor. And closely related to that would be 2 played as a diminished chord. So So both of those variations, because we have the G flat in there, that flat 6 note, they have a bit of a bittersweet sound. And if we wanted to make this a more complex chord sound, we could also play a 1 major 6 chord and alternate it with a 7 diminished 7 chord. This would be more like what you might hear in big band music. And yes, for any fans of Barry Harris, that is the 8-note scale that's created by alternating between these two chord qualities. So as you can see, there are all sorts of different flavors of alternating chords where you start and end on the same chord and you're looking for some sort of tension chord in between that you can move back and forth with. Now let's move on from alternating chords and look at transitional chords. In this case, our departure chord and arrival chord are not the same. And here, you really want to focus on the arrival chord. If our passing chord resolves strongly to the arrival chord, our ears will accept it. And in fact, the arrival chord matters much more than the departure chord. So we're really going to focus on that arrival chord and analyze these passing chords in terms of the chord they're headed to. You heard me do this. So right there, before I went from the 1 to the 6, I played this chord. And this is a secondary dominant. Now, if you've not heard of the concept of secondary dominants before, the idea is we are playing the 5 of a chord other than 1. So in this case, I'm looking for the 5 of this G minor 7 chord. 5 of G is D. So if I play D dominant 7, that will be the 5, or the dominant, in the key of G. And anytime we move from a dominant or a 5 chord to a 1 or tonic chord, that's a very strong resolution. And that's why secondary dominants work so well. Even though this chord, this D dominant 7 chord, doesn't belong in the key of B flat major, it leads so strongly into G minor that our ears accept it. So you can see this idea in action. D7 didn't belong in the key of B flat major, but because it belongs in the key of the arrival chord, G minor, our ears accept it. So this is a secondary dominant. When I played it in our example, I put a different note from the chord in the bass. So I played D7 with F sharp in the bass. And I like that because it leads really strongly into the G just from that half step below in the bass note. If I want to play a variation on this secondary dominant, all I have to do is change from this to this. So all I did was I moved the D to E flat, and now this is a fully diminished 7 chord, F sharp diminished 7, and it's functioning as the 7 diminished 7 of G minor, our 6 chord. So it's 7 diminished 7 of 6. And you can see it almost shares all the same notes with D dominant 7 over F sharp, and it functions in a very similar way. It just leads so strongly into that G chord that it kind of doesn't matter where it fits into the key of B flat major. That leads us well into our third big concept. So chromatic bass notes will often be the foundation for a great choice of a passing chord. Listen to how I led into the C minor chord in the example progression. So I threw in this D flat dominant 13 chord. And there are a number of ways to analyze this chord. We'll get to the headier theory explanation of tritone substitution in a moment. But one practical way to think about it is just that the bass note is a half step above the arrival chord, and we're playing a dominant chord. And that's always going to work great. If you want to lead into a chord, you can lead into it from the dominant chord a half step above the arrival chord. Dominant chords work particularly well for this, but you can also do it with other chord qualities. And if you choose the same chord quality as the arrival chord, so in this case, that would be another minor chord leading to the minor 2 chord, that has a very nice particular sound to it. It's this parallel movement of every voice in the chord. You can do that with more than one chord too. If you want to move past a single passing chord, you could go, right? So there I'm just walking down in half steps from this E flat minor all the way down to our C minor chord. You can even do that coming from beneath the chord. And I could do that with any of the chords in the progression. So if I wanted to lead in chromatically to the 5 sus chord, I could do this. So there I was walking down in half steps from G sus down to F sus. And these are all variations on the same basic idea, which is that we're leading into our arrival chord in half steps. You can do that just in the bass note with that flat 2 dominant idea, or you can do it with the entire chord and have all of the voices move around chromatically to arrive at where you want to end up. All right, now there's one part of the example keys part we haven't explained yet, and it's this part at the end where we go. What is going on there? You know, somehow we went from a bunch of chords belonging in the key of B flat major to chords that have nothing to do with B flat major. You know, D flat major 7, G flat major 7, and then B7 sharp 11. In order to explain this, I want to start by digging in a little bit more to a theory concept I teased, tritone substitution. Compare this chord to this chord. In this case, it's a F dominant 7, which is just a straight up 5 dominant 7 chord in the key of B flat. Very typical chord. You might hear this chord in Beethoven, right? The only thing that has changed is the bass note. And now this becomes a B7 sharp 11, and the sharp 11 is here in the F. This is a tritone substitution, and we're measuring the tritone as the distance between the F and the B in the bass. What's interesting about 2 dominant chords that are a tritone apart is that they actually share their 3rd and 7th. Here is F dominant 7. The 3rd and 7th of the chord are going to be A and E flat. Here is B dominant 7. The 3rd is D sharp, and the 7th is A. But look, if we flip those around, we have the same 3rd and 7th we had in the F dominant 7 chord. So especially if you're willing to hold on to the F and call it a sharp 11 for this B chord, a tritone substitution is often indistinguishable from what it sounds like if the keys player just plays their F dominant 7 chord and the bass player decides to approach their arrival note from a half step above. So most of the time, this is how I think about tritone substitutions. I don't even think about the tritone. I just think, okay, I'm headed towards B flat major, and another way to play the 5 chord instead of playing 5 would be to just come at that B flat major from a half step above. And that's the concept of tritone substitution. So now we've explained the final chord in this funky last part of the Natalie Cole example. What about these other 2 chords? D flat major 7 and G flat major 7. Well, I think this is a good introduction to the concept of extending back further from the arrival chord. And this is something that you can take with you to do with all of these passing chord concepts. If you want to add in more chords to your passing chord moment, you can use the same principles we've been using to lead strongly from one chord into the next, but just extend them further back from where you want to arrive. And we already saw that with those chromatically moving chords in half steps. We could extend that further and get more passing chords. In this case, the movement between these chords is all going around the circle of fifths. D flat is going down a fifth to get to G flat, which goes down a fifth to get to our B dominant 7 chord. So one way of understanding this chord progression is it's closely related to the concept of secondary dominance. With secondary dominance, we're always leading counterclockwise around the circle of fifths so that there's a 5-to-1 resolution in the bass. And even when that 5 chord isn't actually a dominant 7 chord, that movement counterclockwise around the circle of fifths often makes for a really nice forward movement in a chord progression. So that's what I feel is happening here. We have a nice half step movement down from the 3 chord to this flat 3, D flat major 7 chord. And then from there, everything just walks around the circle of fifths until we end up at our nice tritone substitution, or flat 2 dominant 7 chord, to lead back strongly into the 1 chord. And if we wanted, we could use this at other places in the chord progression. So instead of going 1, 6, I could go, well, I want to lead into the 6 with the chord a half step above. I'm going to make it a major 7 chord. And then I'm going to walk back from there around the circle of fifths. So before that, in the circle of fifths would be E flat major. So I'm going to go B flat. And that's one way to lead to a G minor 7. The principle of extending further back from your arrival chord can lead to all sorts of interesting ideas with passing chords. Instead of just playing a secondary dominant, you can turn that 5 chord into a 2-5. So rather than going B flat, D dominant 7, G minor, I could go B flat, A half diminished 7, D dominant 7, G minor. And that whole progression, the A chord going to the D chord, going to the G chord, it's all leading into our arrival chord of G minor. And those are our 5 concepts. We have alternating chords, secondary dominants, chromatic movement in the bass, tritone substitution, and extending further back from the arrival chord. These are a good starting point for you to start to explore passing chords on your own and enjoy this fun, creative tool in harmony. The world of passing chords is endless, so feel free to comment with ones I might have missed or some of your own favorite passing chords that you discover. My name is Ted with Piano Fluency. Thanks for joining me.